Well, that's an interesting question because cities will always be very limited in their role because of limitations of space, water, and also in some respects concern about pollution. Okay? Now, in terms of space and water, this really confines food production to a limited range of products, like vegetables, for example. Okay? It's obviously very difficult to grow, say, for example, poultry or pigs in a city environment, right? So what this implies then is that, cities can make up for a little bit of the import of food from outside, right? But they will never be fully self-sufficient in food. Okay? So the role of cities really, I think, is to provide a small buffer, okay, for times when there's no supply of food. That's number one. But apart from that, there's some real value, for having food production in cities because it also allows greening. Okay? And we all know that gardening, for example, farming is very therapeutic. Yeah? So one of the first attempts to make people recover from certain illnesses is to get them to do gardening. Because gardening provides the aesthetic touch to recover, which is so key. Now, personally, as an educator, I think that the role of food production in cities is also to make people value food. Because if you see how food is produced, then you value food. And once you value food, you try not to waste food. Okay? So to summarize that, I think the role of cities in food production is really very limited. So. It could be more, but that's a question that we need to ask ourselves as well. What is the rationale for growing more food in cities? Cities are meant for people to live in, right? But if food production can provide an environment that really enhances the livability of cities, then that's great. But in terms of food production for food security, cities will always be limited, even by the range of foods that can be produced. As the example I gave, like polluting farms. You obviously don't want them in cities at all. Yeah. So yes, I think a limited role for cities, but important role. Okay? And even to expand production itself, I think we have to be very careful in asking the questions. How do we want to expand production in cities? You don't want to expand it at the expense of something else. Okay? Because cities are meant for people, concentrations of people. I think we must step back 1 minute and ask ourselves, why vertical farming? Okay, vertical farming is so that we can grow more layers, okay, in the same space. Yeah. So basically, we're saying that if we have 1 hectare of land, we can make it 4 hectares or 5 hectares. Okay. Now, the scalability issue is one where it really all depends on cost on one hand, the other on the genetic material of the plants or animals. Plants all need light. Obviously, with vertical farming, plants are not going to equally get all the light they want, which is a real problem. Which is why, for real scalability of vertical farms, I personally favor having controlled environments where you use artificial light. Okay? Because plants, for example, and plants don't need just one kind of food. Plants don't really need all the visible light that we see. But right now, you and I, we're exposed to visible light. Visible light contains many wavelengths. Plants only need a very narrow spectrum of wavelengths. Usually reddish color, light, for them to grow. There's a lot of science now done to show that plants can grow even 3 times as fast without visible light, but with certain wavelengths of light, all under controlled environment. So scalability very much is dictated really by technology, by financial control itself. Yeah, you don't want to grow something where you cannot turn a profit if we're talking about farming as an industry, especially vertical farming as an industry. If we're doing it, for, let's say, hobby, then it's a very different question altogether, yeah? Which is also not a bad idea because all these hotels that we have, all the HDBs that we have, we can also have vertical farming on the side, not as a commercial venture, for people to supplement their food, okay? Which is actually a very good benefit. Okay? And because when I look at food and diets in cities, our diet base is getting narrower and narrower. So to the extent that we can encourage people to grow a more diverse range of indigenous vegetables, we're broadening their diet. And vertical farming on the sides of apartments is very feasible. Give you one example, very good example, which I grow at home, is a 4-angle bean. I don't know whether you know the angle bean, the wing bean. It's a creeper, okay? And it's not the most nutritious vegetables available. It's an indigenous vegetable, which means that it grows here, no pest problems, no disease problems. Yeah? I grew it in my apartment. I have a penthouse though, so I grew it in my penthouse, and I harvest 4-angle bean. It's difficult to buy those now in the market because it's an indigenous vegetable. Most of the vegetables that we buy, we eat at hawker centers, they're usually just green leafy vegetables. And the minerals and vitamins that they supply is actually very limited. They're all very greenish, basically. Yeah? So if we grow a variety of vegetables of different colors, we're then diversifying our diet and improving our nutrition. So there are those other benefits which can accrue from vertical farming as well on a non-commercial scale. I see. Even though the cost of the light is higher, the productivity is much higher because the plants grow faster. And because they're in a controlled environment, there are no pest problems. So there's a quality issue there. High quality vegetables can be produced. We already have that in Singapore on a commercial scale. Look at the Panasonic farm, for example. I'm not advertising for them. The Panasonic farm out in Tuas, it's a completely factory farm, okay? Where everything is controlled, air coming in is controlled, so there are no insect pest problems, okay? No disease problems. The light is controlled, the water is controlled as well. So they can then predict how fast the plants will grow, when they can be harvested. And you imagine, if you can get vegetables to grow 3 times as fast, then you can have more cycles of vegetables, right? So over a 3-month period, you can producing several batches of vegetables instead of just one batch. So straight away, your productivity is much higher in that sense, even though the input cost is higher, but you're getting more produce. Yeah? So potentially your output-input ratio is actually very favorable in that sense. I have kind of mixed feelings on that one. I have to be very candid. Because what we eat, our diet composition, is so influenced by many other factors. Cost, imports, affordability, also cultural preferences. Yeah? The kind of food that we can grow in cities will only supplement whatever we have at the moment, or in some cases, replace what we're importing. So your mix of diet is still the same. Look at the vegetables. There are very, very few new vegetables that are actually grown in urban farming, except in the plant factories, the controlled environment, where you can start growing things like kale, or even cauliflower, which doesn't grow very well outside. And so under those controlled environments, yes, we may shift a little bit more towards vegetables that commonly are temperate vegetables, but are now growing in the temperate and the tropical area. Okay? But overall, I don't see much influence, of urban farming on the really change in diet. Okay? I must always qualify. As a professor, I always qualify. Okay? If through urban farming, there's higher availability of certain kinds of food, then yes, people might prefer to eat that. Yeah? I think tilapia is an example I give because I've traveled all over Asia. Countries like the Philippines, people grow tilapia in their backyard ponds. Okay? Because tilapia is such a hardy fish, you don't even need to feed it. Just from your food waste, for example, or from algae that's growing, they can survive on their own. Yeah? So people get to diversify their protein source. Because amongst the poorer families, they don't eat enough protein. So that's the effect there of change in diet. They can afford to eat protein because they just harvest the fish from the backyard. And catfish is the same. Catfish, in a sense, is more like what we call a bottom feeder. Okay? It just feeds on everything on the bottom, so you can even throw it waste, and it will feed on the waste and grow itself. But for high-quality food, things like what we like to eat, like gropers, and so on, those high-value foods, I don't think people will change their habits very much. They still want to eat those, and they're probably not going to get them any cheaper from urban farming anyways. It's a very good question. How do you best use your space? Now, I'll come back with a counter question. Why does rooftop farming and solar panel farming for energy be exclusive? Why can't they be inclusive? How can it be? All right, for example, if you have factory farm on the rooftop and the solar panel is on top, it actually provides shade for the farm underneath. Okay? So you have a factory farm with solar panel on the top. That is an inclusive use of space. Can you conceptualize that? Not really. Okay. See, factory farms are like this room. So this room can actually be a factory farm. Imagine the rooftop. Okay? Instead of having this roof, on top of this roof, you have the solar panels. So you're tapping energy at the same time, but because the plant factories don't need visible light, you're having artificial light. Okay? So it doesn't rely on sunlight. Yeah? So the sunlight can in fact be used to power the artificial light. The artificial light is the one that powers the plants. Not necessarily, because you're on rooftop. Okay? You're on rooftop first of all, and the LED lighting are actually very energy efficient. Yeah? All farms will fight with office use of energy. All farms will. Yeah, because all the energy at the moment, that are produced, they're also competing uses of energy. But in this case, hopefully the solar energy from the panels can fuel these farms, and I would suggest that there will be excess energy that can then go into the main grid itself. Yeah? That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that by having the solar panels, these urban rooftop farms will not have to take energy from the main grid, which then frees up more energy for the offices and other users. Yeah? So I think we need to think a little bit out of the box when it comes to urban farming on rooftops. Yeah. Now, there are other cities like Seoul in Korea, where they say that some rooftops are not suitable for solar panels. Okay? So the municipal government allows housewives to use those for farming itself. And some of the farms are so successful that the housewives are forming housewives cooperatives because they're producing so much vegetable and they're selling these vegetables. So that also creates employment, part-time employment, plus the fact that the vegetables are fresh. Some people can come, harvest your own vegetables, just like in the countryside. Okay? So there are other values to having this kind of farming. I think the short answer is with difficulty, okay? But I don't look at it as competing at all, okay? Because I see community farming playing a very important role to bring people together, okay? And to really learn to value food, but also importantly to grow food that is fresh, okay, themselves. Now this question of fertilizers, all modern farms require some kind of fertilization, whether it's compost, whether it's artificial fertilizers, yeah? Which is why I advocate, growing indigenous vegetables, especially those that are legumes. Legumes are plants that can tap nitrogen from the soil. They have nodules. The one I mentioned just now, the angle bean, okay, is a legume. So it taps a lot of nitrogen by itself. There's bacteria in the nodules, and they fix nitrogen from the air. As you know, air is lots of free nitrogen. It's no matter how to tap it, yeah, for the plants. So growing indigenous legumes is actually one way that you can reduce fertilizer use itself. The cost question is a very interesting one, because community farms are not meant to be commercial. Okay? They are more like hobby farms. So there are costs associated with maintaining these hobby farms. The question is, how do you minimize those costs to the hobbyists, hobby farmers? Whereas commercial urban farms are a different question altogether. They have their returns on investment calculated quite completely, So they know how much fertilizer they can put in, how much pesticide they use, and actually how much they can grow and how much they price it to make a profit. Yeah? Now the only caveat is that unless community gardens also want to start selling their produce, that's where the price factor comes in. Okay? But I'm not aware of any community garden that's actually actively selling vegetables. Most of them exchange, they sell, they kind of share, vegetables and so on. Because once they start selling, then they're going to get a commercial license to sell. I would say they're both important. And the reason is this. Community farms are generally not located in the areas that the government has designated for farming, the agro-technology parks. You probably know we have 6 of those. Huh? So the commercial farms are usually in those 6 agro-technology parks. However, nowadays, there are also plant factories, which are farms, really in real, I would say, manufacturing areas. Like the Panasonic farm is right in the middle of Tuas, which is not a designated area. But they're growing vegetables under contained environments, like a factory. Okay? So that's a bit of a borderline question there. You don't call them a community farm because they're a commercial farm. And yes, you're right, they're using space. But all use of space, you've got to look at the opportunity cost, right? Is it better to produce microchips or to produce vegetables that you can sell at a higher return? It's all a commercial decision. Okay? Until such time when the government says, okay, we're going to have more commercial community farms because of food security. Okay? Then it becomes a different question altogether. Then there's legislation, there are regulations that come in. Say that we must have this growing in this situation. I don't think we'll reach that stage though. I mean, as you know, right now, 10% of our food is produced locally. Okay? One of the questions that we'll address this afternoon, I think, is how much more do we want to produce? Given all the limitations, the constraints, when food is so much cheaper outside, importing them in. And then there are crops like rice where it doesn't make sense to grow it.
So that's where the value of hobby farming comes in.
Yes, definitely. And the aesthetic values, the social aesthetic values are so important. I think a real benefit from hobby farming. Yeah. Which is why I encourage schools to get children involved in gardening. Because they learn so much from gardening. Yeah.